Hey everybody on YouTube, welcome back to my #Fertility February series that I've got going on just for the month of February. And I didn't really plan on making this video, it's just something that I was thinking about as I was getting ready to start my day this morning. And I think it makes sense for me to share a video talking about how the fertility awareness method has actually helped me spiritually, not just physically and mentally and emotionally, but also spiritually, and the integration of all of those things, and how for me, I really view my routine of taking my temperatures and checking my cervical fluids and charting my cycles as a ritual. And I think I'm going to focus on kind of two things to try to keep this video from getting a little too rambly. I might get a little rambly, but we'll see. But I'm going to talk about specifically how this routine or ritual of the fertility awareness method for me has helped me to develop a vocabulary. Vocabulary or language in the widest sense of the word of something that is used to convey meaning. So for me, my ritual of charting and taking my temperature is not only transformative, but it has helped me to take in and convey information and meaning. So that's one side of it. But also I want to talk about connections and how I connect this ritual of the fertility awareness method that I'm practicing with my spirituality, with my mental emotional health, how everything is connected. So where should I even begin? Well, I think everything is just going to kind of flow. So I am a pantheist chaos witch as of this moment. And chaos not just in the sense of chaos magic and that kind of like established subfield of magic and Western occult practices or whatever you want to call it, but also chaos in the sense of really chaos mathematics, the theories of chaos that were developed in like the 1970s and into the 80s and are still kind of burgeoning fields within mathematics and sciences, particularly in climatology. And so I see chaos and chaotic systems as connections. So if we look at the example of climate, and climate's a very pertinent example when talking about chaos, because one of the first thinkers of chaos was a climatologist. I can't remember the name off the top of my head right now. I'll have it here. But he is the dude that came up with the whole butterfly effect and all of that. So a chaotic system like climate, like human social movements like Black Lives Matter or Water is Life or the Civil Rights Movement or anti-colonial movements throughout history, especially modern history. All of those are chaotic systems, and the system can only work if there are connections. And the chaos part comes in where we can't always predict or foresee where those connections are and what their implications are until we look kind of retrospectively about it. The whole butterfly effect thing. So the butterfly effect is this idea, it's kind of a metaphor of saying the flapping of a butterfly's wings in, I don't know, California can cause a hurricane in Brazil. Well, that is only possible if somehow the butterfly's wings and its flapping is somehow connected to the hurricane that eventually happens off the coast of Brazil or whatever. So the whole theory of chaos is saying that there is a system there, and those connections between the butterfly and the hurricane in Brazil cannot always be foreseen or predicted or understood with traditional Western mathematical and scientific paradigms, like the classic scientific method, or like, I don't know, I wish my husband was here, but he knows more math than I do, but I think you understand where I'm going. So chaos only works when there's connections, right? And that to me is where magic is. Where magic, or what magic is these connections. And so I, as a spiritual practitioner, as a chaos witch, as a daughter of my matron, who I call Mama Creatrix, who is, how can I say this succinctly, primordial chaos. She is the primordial chaos from which we all came and existence came, right, as we know it. So that means everything is connected, and that means I am a co-creatrix within this universe, and that also means I am free to connect different aspects of my life and find the magic in those connections. And for me, that means connecting my work on understanding myself and my psychological work of integration and individuation. I connect that with my spiritual work and my work with my matron and my work being that co-creatrix and affecting change in my little universe bubble, but also in the greater universe, right? Because I'm connected to everything. But it also means that I can connect my physical health and my work with fertility awareness and my observations of my body and the grounding work I do with my body. I can connect all of those things together, and they're all spiritual, they're all psychological, they're all empowering, they're all grounding to me. So really, the fertility awareness method just gave me a vocabulary to understand and really ground into my body. And so kind of to illustrate that, let me give you another example of a time in my life when I acquired a vocabulary that allowed me to work on my mental health. So I grew up in rural, small town Kentucky. At one point I lived in a small town of less than 3,000 people. There was only one grocery store in the whole town, and that was a Save-A-Lot, and we had to drive 20 minutes to the neighboring county to get to the closest Walmart and the closest movie theater, right? And I grew up fairly poor. My parents both grew up poor and in really rough, abusive situations. And so growing up for me, there was no discussion of mental health because from my parents' perspectives, there were more immediate needs. Like when my dad retired from the Army, he realized that his military retirement wasn't that much. It wasn't enough to support a wife and 2 small children. He struggled to find a job for a few years, working odd jobs as like a part-time janitor at a mall, basically making $7.50 an hour. He worked as a truck driver, he worked at a factory, he did everything because his training in the military did not translate well into civilian life. Like the skills he was taught in the military did not translate well. He did have a panic attack. He thought he was having a heart attack, but it turned out to be a panic attack because he didn't know how he was going to support us, and he was afraid that we were going to lose our house. My father's way to cope with all this stress in this situation, he learned as a child and a young adult. It was the same way that he coped with the extreme physical abuse he suffered and the poverty and the instability he suffered as a child. His method was just shove those emotions down. Shove them down, get through it, don't think, don't feel too much about it. And it's kind of a similar way that my mom survived. My My mom was abused in a different way. She suffered sexual abuse, and she also, while she was in the military, was assaulted, raped. She was raped, right? So she also grew up kind of poor, and just mental health was just not part of the vocabulary. There was no discussion of it. And so my sister and I were raised in this household where there was zero discussion and zero access to resources to learn how to talk about mental and emotional health. Even though we all could have benefited from it. But like I said, when it's, that idea of the scarcity mindset, it wasn't a scarcity mindset, it was our lived reality, right? Like, I grew up thinking that Kroger was the place where rich people did their grocery shopping, right? That's kind of how poor we were. And for those of you who live in different parts of the country, Kroger's just like a typical grocery store chain in the southeast of the United States. If you're familiar with like Stop and Shop or ShopRite in the northeast, or maybe like Ralph's on the west coast, I don't know, it would be that equivalent. So I thought that's where rich people got their groceries, because we got our groceries at Save-A-Lot and Aldi. Because that was the only option we had. So, right, I grew up poor. Scarcity wasn't just a mindset that we had to overcome, it was a lived reality. It was definitely even worse for my parents growing up, right? So by the time I went off to college, I was surrounded by people who were much more privileged than I was, who grew up with a lot more money than I did. And they were the ones who introduced me to the possibility of talking about your feelings. They introduced me to the possibility of therapy. That was where I started to gain the vocabulary that I needed to even put a name to how I was feeling and my lived reality. Just like when I started taking women's studies courses, particularly the courses that I took about the history of race and sexuality and intersectionality and queer theory and stuff, that gave me the vocabulary to talk about things like the impact of colonialism that we're still living with, racism, patriarchy, sexism, oppression. Really, it gave me the vocabulary to put a name to how I felt, right? Being a cisgendered woman who grew up poor in isolated rural Kentucky. So I gained these vocabularies to begin to talk about and think about my experiences, and eventually I did have my own kind of mental emotional breakdown. I was suicidal, so my junior year of college had to check myself into a mental hospital for a while. When I got out, I took that knowledge with me to my home. When my mom had a pretty severe mental breakdown again, I was the one who encouraged her to check herself into the hospital and get help. Turned out that's where she discovered, and when she was diagnosed with bipolar 1. A little bit later, my sister was diagnosed with bipolar 2 and sought help. So it was in college, and it was going through these breakdowns, but also being exposed to these ideas that I gained this vocabulary to begin to talk about my mental emotional health and my journey or struggles or whatever you want to call it with depression and anxiety, which I still work through, right? So that's where that started. So fast forward to the fertility awareness method, I, about 2 years ago, was experiencing some health issues, somewhat minor, but still very annoying and stressful health issues with my menstrual cycle and my some of my reproductive organs and whatnot. And I just knew intuitively that these issues were linked to my mental and emotional health. I just knew that the anxiety that I had yet to address, really, because when I was in college I addressed and put a name to the depression I was having, but I didn't really focus on or address anxiety until I went to grad school, until I was in Massachusetts, basically, at this time. So the health issues I was suffering, I knew. I just intuitively, in my bones, in my gut, no one can convince me otherwise, I just knew that it was my anxiety, my body's way of telling me, like, look, you need to focus on this. You need to focus on this. And it was also my body telling me, look, you need to work through generational trauma, which I've talked about in other videos on my channel, is how trauma can affect multiple generations, not just the people who suffered it directly, right? And both of my sides of my family suffered generations upon generations of sexual abuse, physical abuse, poverty, that kind of stuff. Scarcity being a reality, lived reality. So that was something, that was my body telling me it's time to work on this. The generations of trauma, your anxiety, and also your own personal traumas that you went through in different relationships that I had throughout my 20s, right? So before I had ever heard of the fertility awareness method, I was already kind of charting my own cycles in my own kind of invented way. I would draw a calendar down in a notebook, and I created little symbols to track my symptoms of different parts of my cycle. And so I was already intuitively knowing, like, I need to pay attention to this. I need to look for patterns. And then, I don't remember exactly how I stumbled upon this, but I heard of this thing called Taking Charge of Your Fertility and the Fertility Awareness Method, this book. And I read it cover to cover, and that's when I gained the vocabulary I needed to understand what the fuck was going on with my body. Until I was 29 years old, when I first read this book and heard about the fertility awareness method, I had no idea there were 4 phases to my cycle. I didn't have a name for where the progesterone came from during the luteal phase. I didn't understand why sometimes I felt pain around the time of ovulation in one of my 2 ovaries. I didn't understand any of this because, again, like, rural Kentucky, Bible Belt, no one taught me this shit, so I had to find out on my own, right? So after gaining that vocabulary, I was able to establish my own ritual of charting and temperature taking and looking over my charts and learning the rhythms of my body and being able to talk about it in terms of fertility, and fertility being the health, the overall health of my menstrual cycle, right? And it was so empowering. There's nothing quite as grounding as truly understanding what's going on in your body at any given time. And for those of us in the pagan-y, new agey, witchy realm, we understand the importance of grounding, of connecting down into not just connecting with the earth and the trees and the blah blah, but like really sitting in your body. Something that at least Western thought likes to disconnect from the mind. But grounding, it forces you to connect the head back to the body and realize that your thoughts and emotions have an impact on your physical health. And that if anything comes up in your body, it's your body's way of telling you you need to pay attention to a certain aspect of your life. You need to process this trauma. You need to think about and cry and feel the pain that you've been suppressing for decades. Because if you don't, these issues in your physical health are just going to get worse, right? And actually just recently I got this book at Goodwill just randomly, Women's Bodies, Women's Wisdom, and as you can see, I'm very much still at the very beginning. But this author, who is an OBGYN, Christiane Northrup, she really kind of proposes this idea of grounding being this reconnecting your mind to your body and realizing that your emotions and your thoughts have an impact on your health and can benefit you once you start to pay attention to them. She really connects that idea with the idea of the oppression that women and femmes receive, and how really the personal is political. So if you suffered any sort of child abuse, be it physical or sexual, or if you suffered any sort of sexual violence, that is patriarchy. That is patriarchy. That is institutionalized, the ideology of patriarchy having an impact on your individual life. So it's a social issue that has impacted individuals. And I think the Me Too movement right now is kind of forcing more people to open their eyes to that. So, yeah, where am I going with this? So, this fertility awareness method has forced me to sit down and just be in my body and observe my body without judgment. Just observing and letting my body be the teacher. And that has been so fucking powerful. Sometimes your physical body can be the best teacher that you need in that moment when you're trying to figure out what the fuck is going on with my body. Sometimes you just need to sit with it and listen. And that's one of the greatest lessons that I've received from practicing this fertility awareness method. Because my body was, like I said, telling me I need to sit down with my anxiety and my traumas. I need to process them. I need to feel them. I need to cry about it. I need to release emotions about it, emotions that I had been suppressing and taught to suppress by patriarchy. And I needed to go through that process because that process is called healing. And it's still ongoing, but it has been so empowering and healing. And I don't know, like I cannot properly convey to you guys how empowering this past 10 cycles now that I've been charting, how empowering they have been and how healing they have been and how they have helped me to truly integrate not just shadows and my anxiety into my process of individuation and all that, but also integrate my focus on my body and this process of grounding that is the fertility awareness method into my spirituality, and how I construct my spell work has been influenced by this, how I meditate has been influenced by this, how I commune with my matron and the different spiritual archetypes or symbols or beings or whatever that I work with. It's really been a process of connection, that chaotic process of connection, and even the unseen or unforeseen connections that that chaotic systems reveal to us and that we can learn from, and that you know, that give us the magic. I started reading yesterday another amazing Goodwill find, Toward a Psychology of Awakening by John Wellwood. And actually, I don't know anything about this author besides what he said in the introduction, but apparently he claims he coined the term spiritual bypassing back in the mid-'80s with his work, but he's a psychologist, a psychoanalyst, and he, in his research and in his work, strives to connect spiritual practice with the practices of Western psychology. So the subtitle of the book is Buddhism, Psychotherapy, and the Path of Personal and Spiritual Transformation. So he's proposing this term, the psychology of awakening, connecting spiritual awakening, the spiritual awakening that comes through meditative practice and just a deep insight and knowing, and transpersonal or supra-personal experiences, connecting that with the focus of Western psychology on, or at least psychoanalysis, on the process of individuation and integration, and the personal and the interpersonal. So you have the personal, interpersonal, and then what he calls the supra-personal, the transpersonal, like what is beyond, right? So again, this theme of connection just keeps coming up, and connecting the psychological with the spiritual, with the physical, has been just, for me, there's no going back. There's no going back. And the fertility awareness method has been a key component of that connection of those three kind of realms of my being, if you will. Really, like, I'm lacking the proper words to truly describe this. And this has been kind of a rambly video, but hopefully there's been a somewhat clear path that I've followed to kind of convey to you guys how transformative and empowering and healing the fertility awareness method has been for me, and how much I've benefited from it, not just in understanding how my body works and in healing my body and listening to it, but also how empowering it's been and how transformative it's been in developing my understanding of chaos and chaos magic, and truly what that means to me and my personal truths and my personal spiritual truths. And it's just, it's been such a beautiful, intense growing process. So I know that probably because of the influence of Western ideologies and Western medicine, we tend to compartmentalize our lives, and to a degree that's a very helpful technique, but sometimes you have to integrate. Sometimes you need to build bridges and understand that, you know, these psychological issues are actually showing up in my body, and maybe my body's telling me something. Maybe I need to listen and just be present in my body and learn from it. Just like connecting this to the rest of you, it's all about connection, connecting these different facets of our lives and bridging those gaps of understanding, and just enjoying the ride, because it's been one hell of a ride for me anyway. So yeah, that is how I would kind of describe how the fertility awareness method has been not just a tool for me to prevent pregnancy, or a tool for me to kind of understand how my body's working and maybe diagnose some problems that I've been noticing with my cycle or whatever. It's really been a tool of integration and a tool of spiritual growth. It's been a transformative process, and there's no going back for me. So yeah. I think I'll wrap that video up and end it with that. Yeah, until next time, happy charting.